Good morning. Today we finish the 15th chapter of Mark, verses 26 through 47. And these are probably some of the hardest words to read. It's the time of Jesus hanging on the cross, the last 6 hours of his life, and his burial. And it begins with, it tells us the inscription of the charge against him was, and in parentheses, the King of the Jews. And in other Gospels, it tells us that the religious leaders went to Pilate and said, "To change that." And, and Pilate says, "I have written what I have written, the King of the Jews." And this was the charge against Jesus. This was why he was crucified, because, he claimed in so many words, or in not so many words, to be the Messiah, to be the Son of God. And they just couldn't accept that. So he's hanging on the cross because of that. And Mark's gospel, like the others, have two bandits, one on either side hanging there. But in Mark's gospel, the bandits, just like everyone else, mock Jesus. And I so appreciate the one bandit who sees the good in Jesus. But in Mark's gospel, this is the Roman centurion. Verse 39, when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, when Jesus died, the centurion says, "Truly, this man is the Son of God." So the Roman centurion is the one who gives that statement of faith at Jesus' death. And as the mocking is going on, you saved others, you saved yourself, and I think about how many others did Jesus save? How many others did Jesus give life back to? Several. We read that way, but he had healed and made such an impact on so many lives. But that was all discounted. And then verse 33, when it was noon, so 3 hours Jesus has been hanging on the cross, because he was crucified 9 o'clock. And I mentioned that yesterday. Here it is again, 9 o'clock today, this morning. And 3 hours Jesus has been hanging there in pain and in agony. And at noon, darkness comes for 3 hours. And we don't hear much about that 3 hours of time, but I think about it, that the darkness that is there. I mean, there's, it tells us, just after the centurion's statement of Jesus God being God's son, I mean, of, several of the women watching, but, it doesn't tell us what was going on in that 3 hours of darkness. And think about that, the middle of the day, noon, when the sun is, mostly overhead, and it's the brightest part of the day normally. It's totally dark for 3 hours. And it wasn't, you think about, an eclipse. I mean, not so long ago we had an eclipse of the moon, and it was, at night. But even then, it wasn't completely dark. But God causes darkness to come over this, at least this part of the world. And the fear that would be in people's hearts and minds, it's just, it would bring, I don't know, I don't know how to even explain the feelings that, we can imagine that we would have, having this time of utter darkness. And then the next verse, at 3 o'clock, Jesus cries out, "Eloi, Eloi," or "Oh my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" But knowing full well that God didn't forsake him. But Mark's gospel doesn't have anything other than that for Jesus' words on the cross. And that sentence is one of what's known as the 7 last words of Christ. And I remember growing up, I was thinking, well, there were 7 words, but in that, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? There's a lot more than 7 words just in that. But we know it's combined with the other, Into your hands I commend my spirit, and forgive them, for they know not what they do. It is finished. The different words that different gospel writers attribute to Jesus on the cross. But he dies. Verse 37, he gives a loud cry and breathed his last. And as Jesus breathed his last, Mark tells us that the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And, it was split asunder. And people have looked at that, and we talk about that as being, God taking away the barrier between God and humans. It was that curtain in the temple that the high priest would go behind, that once a year for those special duties. And it was a sacred place, but now it was open for all to see. And the kingdom of heaven was made available for all people in that act. And then, the curtain being torn in two, the centurion at the foot of the cross would have no idea of that. But this is when that centurion, looking at all that happened, with Jesus hanging on the cross, whatever Jesus said and did, and all of that, and Jesus crying out and giving up his spirit that way, the Roman centurion recognizes God in Jesus Christ. And the women looking on, it says, it was Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the younger, and Joseph and Salome. They used to follow him and provide meals for him and the others as he was in Galilee. And there were many other women who had come with him to Jerusalem. So even though Jesus was on the cross alone, two criminals beside him, but there were many of the faithful women who had been following and serving Jesus and had done so much for Jesus were there. And the other Gospels, John's Gospel especially, tells us that, at least some of the men were there as well. But the reality is that Jesus didn't die alone. God was there. Jesus being God, God was there. And I think of that moment in the movie The Passion of the Christ, as Jesus dies and that single teardrop comes from heaven. And it's a very powerful, powerful scene. That Jesus, came for you and for me and for all people and the people of his time. Just like Jesus lamented over Jerusalem, killer of the prophets. And, they did that to Jesus as well. And it's so hard to even comprehend in so many ways the confidence that Jesus had in God that could bring him to that point, that he submitted to that pain, to the anguish, to the mocking, the scorn, to all of what it was, so that the plan of God for you and for me that doesn't make any sense to us would come to completion. Verse 42 and on, when evening had come, and the day, it was a day of preparation, the day before the Sabbath. They had to get things done and buttoned up before the Sabbath. Otherwise, Jesus' body would be there for the whole day of the Sabbath. But Joseph of Arimathea, one of the leaders of the council, and this is the Sanhedrin, he wasn't only a Pharisee, but he was on the council of the 70. Very respected man who was a follower of Jesus came and took Jesus' body down. And Mark's gospel tells us simply that Joseph brought a linen cloth, taking the body down, wrapped it in that linen cloth, and laid it in a tomb and rolled a stone against the door of the tomb. And the last thing we read today is that Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where the body was laid. So a horrible, painful day again to read this awful story of Jesus' death. It just doesn't ever get any easier. We're fortunate that we know that Easter comes. And we know that tomorrow we read Mark 16 with the resurrection, with Jesus no longer in the tomb. But doesn't take away the pain and the hurt and the sorrow. And I think about that for so many in our world. That, I mean, we all have loved ones that have died at some point in time in our lives, and the feeling of loss, the feeling of what do we do now? What do we do now? We entrust them, as we always do, into the loving care of a God who loves them enough to spread his arms on the cross.